The Ferrari Testarossa is probably the most iconic, one of the most successful cars produced by Ferrari. They are not rare by any means. Ferrari produced about 7,000, I think it was like 7,700 cars between 1984 and 1991. There was a few different variations in those early days. So you had the early 84, 85, 86 cars. Those were called a flying mirror. They had one mirror protruding from the driver's side, which actually looked very cool, and they're rare cars. And the later cars then went to normal mirrors, and they had one, some people call those mono something. They had one lug nut, so it was a center lug. And then that later developed into a 5-lug car, and that was the end of the Testarossa run. That would develop into really what is, to me, the best variations of the Testarossa, the most rare, the most exciting, and the most comfortable, the 512TR and the 512M. Now, I don't think we've driven one of these cars for you guys. Normally, we're in some wacky car, a 959, a Diablo, a Countach. But I have to tell you, every time that we have a 512TR or a 512M in our inventory, it's the first car that I grab the keys for. These cars are just spectacular. Now, what Ferrari did when they developed these cars is they changed the interior layout. It's not as sort of, I would call it 80s spaceship. It's more clean, it's more elegant. You know, the lines are sort of rounded off, whereas the Testarossa is very square and angular in the interior. The seats are much bigger, they're much more comfortable. And I would say the biggest thing is sort of, it just feels like, I wouldn't call it a luxury car by any means, but it's very much a comfortable car, whereas the older Testarossa is not the most comfortable car. They're much more comfortable than a Countach or any cars like that. But again, the 512TR and M are just so comfortable. The next changes come from the outside. Larger wheels, 18-inch wheels, upgraded brakes, upgraded suspension. The front and rear fascia have been upgraded as well, the look of the car. And then when you get into the insides, what Ferrari did was they basically did everything better. The AC is incredible. We're in Miami right now. I didn't even have the AC on cold. And this is a car that literally I could drive all day with this AC. The blower is great. Everything about the AC is awesome in this car. I love it. The other thing that sort of the biggest change is they actually lowered the engine and they changed the intakes, they changed the valves, they changed a bunch of things on the engine, including the electronic ignition system and also the electronic fuel injection. So much, much greater advancement. When you drive the car, you feel it between torque, you feel it in the horsepower. These cars are just a tad over 420 horsepower, where the earlier Testarossas were around 380 horsepower. So you feel it. And I would say just overall, the clutch is lighter, the brakes are better, the steering is lighter, and the later 512TRs and 512Ms actually even got ABS. So again, we're talking a much more advanced car. I've got the window down now because I love the way these cars sound. This car is completely stock, so it's not terribly loud. But again, it does sound great. I love like a 2B exhaust on these cars. They just really open up and they sound awesome. I would say then the next biggest change, so the 512TR was that first big jump. Ferrari produced 2,200 cars for the world. About, I think the exact number for the US is 408 cars. This car is basically the last iteration. Now, I know there's a lot of collectors and you talk to enthusiasts and they say, oh, I love the classic look of the Testarossa, but really the 512M to me is just the ultimate. 75 cars were produced for the US, and then around the world, let's call it another 425 cars. I've seen production numbers at 500, 501. I've even seen production numbers less than 500. But the 512M produced between the late 94 and early 1996 is the rarest version of the Testarossa produced. The US car would be the most rare. All of the US cars were actually numbered. And you just feel the torque of this car. So easy to drive, easy to shift, And again, I mean, the steering is like butter, and I'm comfortable. I mean, I could legitimately drive this car all day long without sort of, there's no, I would say, there's nothing that makes me complain about this car. Again, I know it's a classic car. I know it's not as perfect as a new car, but this is something you could just drive all day long. Back to 512M. So then you have the rest of the world cars. The biggest difference between the rest of the world and the US cars, the US cars were numbered. So individually numbered. I think we've owned 3 or 4 of the US cars. To date, we've owned probably 4 of the European cars. The biggest difference on the European cars, they don't have the side marker lights. Obviously, the gauge cluster is in kilometers per hour. They don't have a little plaque right here by the radio that would show the number on the US cars. And then they don't have the same exhaust system as the US cars, but really that's the only difference. When you first look at a 512 TR, what Ferrari essentially did was they used the base of the 512 TR, the updated bumpers, the updated wheels, and then they modified that into the M, the modificata. Essentially what you have is the wheels that sort of look like they're spinning, but they're a multi-piece wheel. They've got these beautiful studs and a polished lip. Then at the rear of the car, they've actually integrated 355 taillights into the rear, still maintaining that beautiful wide design with the louvers, but I sort of like the 355 lights. Some purists don't love it. And then we'll get into the more controversial topic. Sort of in the lines of the F50 and F40 in design language, they actually opened the headlights. So it's no longer pop-up headlights. The 512M has these massive glass headlights and this unique projector system when you open the front bonnet. That's cool to see. But essentially, like the F40 and F50, the open lights, and then the bumper's a touch different than the TR. But again, very similar. In the interior, everything's the same with the exception of the steering wheel, which is just sort of, I would say, a little bit more fancier, very similar to the F50 steering wheel. And so much power, it just does it effortlessly. And that's sort of, the beauty of the flat 12 from Ferrari. You just feel the power behind you. It's not like, earlier today I was driving a 355, and the 355, to get power out of that car, I mean, you are pushing that car above 5,000 RPM and just holding into the throttle. Whereas these Testarossas, I mean, 3,500 RPM, 3,000 RPM, I'm feeling a lot of power, and you sort of feel it in your gut and in your butt. It's so cool. And that's what I love about these V12 cars. Really, everything else about this car is just great. They don't have the same electronical issues and fuel injection issues as the early Testarossas. So a lot of really great updates. And this car is just, to me, this is the ultimate iteration of one of the most iconic Ferrari designs of our time. I'm in love with these cars. What's interesting is looking back, you see prices of these cars, for years were 200,000 and 300,000, and just recently, I would say you start seeing 512Ms and 512 TRs sell at auction for 400, 500, as much as 600,000. I think the market is really starting to appreciate these cars. I've always appreciated them. I think, again, this really is a perfect classic car that someone could drive, they could enjoy. When you think of the price of a new Ferrari today, I think an SF90 is almost 700,000 with options. I think over MSRP, they're even bringing 900,000, $1 million. A 488, with options could be 400,000. The new F8 and 296 GTS, all these cars 400, 500,000. So to me, while I love the new cars, I'd much rather have a 512 TR, 512M, something on the weekend you can drive, enjoy. They're rare, and I believe these cars will forever hold their value and definitely go up.